these back with you. How you doing? How you been? Does it all collapse?
Which pamphlet is that?
Summary.
Oh, and it, yeah, I had one. I came to a meeting last week, got that, and I put it down somewhere. I don't know where I put it, so I'm gonna have to get another one. Hello again.
Hello, how are you? How's your well situation?
The pump is dead.
Oh, okay.
And so it's gonna cost about 3,500 or 4,000. It's better than if the well had gone dry, which would be 10,000 or something.
You gotta move the rivers.
Well, there's a fellow who's worked for me for about 35 years. Electrician who used to be a White House electrician when I was on the ESC staff. Yeah, okay. Well, he came last night because the water treatment company said, we're plumbers, we're not electricians. And they said, you probably don't have anything wrong with your pump. You just need to replace that fuse, but we're not allowed to replace it. So I went out to the Home Depot and got the fuses. And my electrician came at 7:30 at night. And we ran through 3 fuses blowing before he said, Barbara, get your pump.
Oh, yeah.
But it's nice to have somebody you've known forever that'll do that. He couldn't come this morning because he had a funeral to go to. So he was willing to come at night.
So what's going on with this? Yeah. I didn't see this famous street like this.
Right. Switch back and forth. Come against all leaving. See you. Sorry.
So what's happening? Hey, Jose.
I just kind of lost my own.
What? What?
Is this on? I'm on tonight.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, well,
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation's Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website, and those who are also joining us on C-SPAN Network. For those in-house, we would ask that courtesy to see that our mobile devices have been silenced or turned off. It's always appreciated. And for those watching online, you're welcome to send questions or comments at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. And we will, of course, post today's program on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. Leading the discussion following our special opening remarks will be David Shedd. David serves as a visiting fellow in our Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy. Welcoming on behalf of Heritage and welcoming and introducing Senator will be Kim Holmes. Dr. Holmes serves as our Executive Vice President. Please join in welcoming him.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Heritage Foundation. This is the second time I've been at this podium this morning. We welcomed the President of Georgia here for a 2-hour discussion, and he gave a speech from here. But it's certainly an honor to welcome you, Senator, to the Heritage Foundation. We have a long history Certainly from the work that when I was back here as an analyst and vice president for foreign policy back in the 90s trying to get NAFTA approved, working with conservatives in the Republican Party. David Shedd and Ambassador Negroponte were, of course, very much involved in that, and we're so pleased to have all of you here as well. But before I introduce our guest speaker, I'd like to start with a couple of facts. Going into its 24th year, the North American Free Trade Agreement has been, in our humble opinion, a success story. Overall, NAFTA trade agreements between the three countries, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, has increased from $290 billion in 1993, the trade, that is, between these three countries, $290 billion in 1993 to more than $1 trillion in 2016. U.S. manufactured good exports to Canada and Mexico support more than 2 million American jobs. And Mexico and Canada are the first and second largest importers of American agricultural goods. Often ignored in the NAFTA success story are the national security benefits of this agreement, which you will be hearing more about in the panel discussion and certainly from Senator Sass. As joint economic security between both countries expanded as a result of the NAFTA agreement, American cooperation with Mexican law enforcement to combat organized crime, to identify counterterrorism opportunities, and to address illegal immigration has also reached unprecedented levels. Yet after 7 rounds of contentious negotiations, the future of NAFTA is uncertain. NAFTA could be certainly improved. I think almost everyone agrees with that. But it also has resulted in many proven positive impacts on the American economy, on American national security. And just yesterday, the Heritage Foundation published a new research paper exploring all these linkages. Today, our distinguished fellow, David Shedd, will lead a panel discussion with noted U.S. national security experts who have served in the highest levels of government to discuss the implications of withdrawing from NAFTA. But first, I'm honored to welcome Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska, who will deliver a keynote address on why a stronger NAFTA would boost not only free trade, but also the national security interests of the United States. Trade issues are at the top of priority for Senator Sasse, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Senator Ben Sasse represents, of course, the great state of Nebraska. We were having a chat about walking beans and doing various things to corn, which I dare not talk about because I don't fully understand what he was talking about. But he's a fifth-generation Nebraskan. He comes to the Senate having spent the previous 5 years as a college president. When he was recruited to take over the Midland University, he was just 37 years old, making him one of the youngest college presidents in the nation. The 130-year-old Lutheran College was on the verge of bankruptcy when he arrived, but it became instead one of the fastest-growing higher education institutions in the country. Most of Senator Sasse's career has been spent guiding companies and institutions through times of crisis, and he does so with straight talk and with strong determination. He has worked with the Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey & Company, as well as private equity firms and not-for-profit organizations to tackle some of the failing strategies across a broad array of sectors and nations. So please join me in welcoming Senator Sasse.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks to Heritage, and thanks to all of you for having me. Kim did tell me that even though originally I only had 15 or 20 minutes to help kick off this panel, he said if I would give details on agriculture, particularly detasseling corn and walking beans, I could have an extra hour. So you're all going to be privileged to get into some serious agricultural stuff. He also was complimenting my boots, which I appreciated, and he asked what's up with that. He didn't realize that Nebraska is the largest beef state in the union. He then wanted to ask technical questions about beef versus cattle and whether or not Texans in the room would be offended at my claims. So we're also going to do a little bit of parsing about how you go from a cow-calf season in Texas and you migrate north to slaughter in Nebraska. This gets me an extra hour of bonus time to unpack ag as well. You have a really distinguished panel, and there are a whole bunch of technical things that you're going to learn from them and that I'm looking forward to learning from them as well. I'm not going to try to compete with that. There are a whole bunch of aspects to the way we do counterintelligence, and we do border security, and we do drug interdiction, and we do human trafficking partnerships or anti-human trafficking partnerships with Mexico that I think you're going to hear unpacked by your really distinguished panel this afternoon. And I won't speculate on that and the implications of the timing and the unfolding of NAFTA negotiations for the Mexican election. But I would just flag that that's a very significant thing that I don't think has been covered in the US media accounts of what's happening in NAFTA as well. So there's a lot to be discussed this afternoon. I'm going to limit myself to setting the backdrop for some of this discussion. And with limited time, I'm going to give you something more approaching a listicle as the kickoff for my talk, and then I'll unpack it in just a little more detail. But I'd like to sort of offer 6 theses for your consideration. The first is that when we discuss trade, and our broader topic today is the relationship between economic partnerships and military partnerships across the globe, but especially in North America. When we discuss trade, the American people right now regularly jump to job change and job disruption, and there's a basic true fact that we should all have in common that we don't all have in common, which is that technology, not trade, is overwhelmingly the primary driver of job change and job disruption in America. That is, technology, not trade, is the overwhelming driver of job disruption in America today. Number 2, if you look at the effects of trade just from an economic standpoint, we're obviously going to get to national security implications of trade as well today, but if you look at trade just as an economic matter, it has been indisputably good for the US. Throughout history, this isn't academic theory, this is historical reality, and NAFTA in particular has been indisputably good for the US. It's also been indisputably good for Mexico, and it's also been indisputably good for Canada, and there's nothing internally inconsistent about those statements because trade done right is a win-win. And regularly in our public discourse, we don't talk about that clearly. So I think it's useful to unpack a little bit when you look at the economic ledger, how to think about the consumer benefits of trade, the producer benefits of trade, and then in reverse, if you look at more tariffs or more protection, the consumer costs of trade, the producer costs of trade, and then the retaliatory synergistic effects where you get costs again on consumers and producers as you cascade from one kind of protectionism to other types of protectionism. So my second thesis for you is that trade is indisputably good as an economic matter. Number 3, we have very little public understanding of what the term trade deficit means, and not understanding what a trade deficit is has huge negative consequences for our public deliberation about trade. So we should talk just a tiny little bit about what the term trade deficit means. And really, we should fight hard. And I think for those of us who are in public life for a time, or those who are in the academic or the think tank world, or those of you in the journalistic community, I think we should regularly stop whenever someone says trade deficit and say, when you say trade deficit, do you really just mean trade product deficit? Because I assume that you do, but if we're going to talk about that, then let's make sure we also get back to the trade services surplus and the foreign direct investment surplus that the U.S. almost always has whenever we talk about a bilateral trade product deficit. So number 3, the term trade deficit is not well understood, and we can't deliberate well as a people about trade without unpacking a little bit about what we think we're saying when we say trade deficit. Number 4, the American people are not to blame for this confusion. This is overwhelmingly the fault of leaders to not talk clearly about where we are in economic history. And unless we go slower and we unpack where we are in economic history, there is going to be so much anxiety about job churn and job change, understandably, that people are going to look for boogeymen. And right now, trade is suffering a lot of the boogeyman negative consequences of us not deliberating clearly about where we are in economic history, because we are going through a time of radical change. The technological and in particular digital revolution that we are living through may well 100 years from now look in the rearview mirror as disruptive, not just to economics, but to basic human community as industrialization and urbanization. And if we're going through that kind of a revolution, we should have some sense of what we're living through so that we as a people can deliberate about it clearly. And this town is failing radically to have any meaningful discussion about where we are in economic history. And so a lot of what feels like Washington breaking down is Washington breaking down at the basic level of policy deliberation, but more fundamentally, it's Washington not having done the first thing of leading to help the American people have a big, broad conversation about what we think, what sort of problems are amenable to political solutions and what sort of problems are probably not amenable to political solutions. When we unpack that, what I would say is that we're going through a time where there's such radical erosion of social capital, radical and rapid, that most people feel such hollowness in our lives. And as people who are meant to be relational beings, as people who are meant to be tribal beings, if our tribes are evaporating, we're still gonna try to figure out a way to create tribe. And a really lame way to create tribe is by doing anti-tribe. But that's what's happening all around us, where people are saying, well, I don't have a lot of tribe, but maybe I can at least have the enemy of my enemy be my friend for a time, and we can be shared in what we're anti to. And right now there's a whole bunch of that going on, which is some of the reason that Washington doesn't look like it makes much progress on pragmatic, small ball legislative policymaking, because there's not a broader shared understanding of where we are in history. Number 5, and this is more than the McDonald's thesis of Sam Huntington and other people, but number 5, I would say that when you have lots of economic relationship between two countries or between a block of countries, when you have a lot of commerce between peoples, you end up building other kinds of relationships as well, which often have huge global security implications. This isn't really that profound. It turns out that you're less likely to go to war with people that you know and like and have shared interests with. There's really nothing profound about this. But when we talk about trade and we isolate it from global security and national security considerations, we're pretending that people are just disembodied, rational robot sort of calculators making decisions about what their interests are in the world, as if they aren't embodied people that have economic interests and communities and relationships and friends. And it turns out when you have a lot more economic relationship, you're much more likely to find shared understanding about global security matters, both for the good, sort of building alliances, but also for the avoidance of the bad. Misunderstandings tend to be dealt with better if you have lots of overlapping relationships. To take it from some of the literature about family breakdown that's out there right now, it turns out that people who have to practice marriage in the context of community are better at marriage than people who practice marriage without a lot of relationships densely packed around them. It turns out if you have a bunch of little bumps in your marriage, but you share lots of common friends, and you have family members, and you have neighbors, it turns out you can solve lots of problems that might otherwise spin out of control. The same is true in economic and military security. And 6th and finally, and reaching far beyond just our NAFTA discussions today, we should be clear about where we are in geopolitical competition over the coming decades. China has a plan, and we don't have a plan. China has a plan for where they would like to see global economic relations and global security relations go. And the United States right now surely doesn't look like we have a plan. Again, those 6 theses are far more than enough that I promise I won't be able to finish on time, but I'll try to go very fast back through them, and then we'll take a few questions, and then Kim will pull me from the stage. So back to number 1. It is indisputable that what is happening right now in the disruption of work is a consequence primarily of technology, not primarily of trade. Trade is a big deal. I don't think there's anybody in the US Senate that is more pro-trade than I am. I think trade has immense human benefits. And yet, trade is not really what's driving most of the anxiety people feel right now. And we need to be clearer about what is happening economically. So by analog, let's look at what happened to agriculture over the last century and a quarter, and then what is now happening to industrial, I think of them as big tool economy jobs. Because if we understood the analogy to agriculture, we would know how ridiculous it is to talk like we're trying to make America 1950 again. No one is ever going to make America 1950 again in terms of large-scale industrial jobs, and no one is ever going to make America 1850 again in terms of agricultural jobs, and none of us would think that we would want that. So in 1900, 41% of American workers worked on the farm. Today, it's well under 2%. Total agricultural output is off the charts higher in terms of quantity and quality than 118 years ago. 41% of Americans on the farm in 1900, more than that still lived and worked on the farm. Urbanization is happening, but as a matter of work, 41% of American workers are on the farm in 1900. Today, less than 2%, more total output. What's happening in manufacturing? Because the rhetoric in this town where politicians always lie and pretend they can fix whatever big bit of anxiety you have, we're going to bring back industrial factory jobs from the 1950s. No, we're not. That is simply not true. It's not what's going to happen, and there's no economic theory to defend that rubbish. The high watermark of industrial employment in US history was in the mid-1950s, where 31% of American workers worked in factories. Today, 7% of American workers work in factories, and there's more total output in terms of both quantity and quality. The shape of the curve from the agricultural revolution, and I don't mean the agricultural revolution of Mesopotamia 11,000 years ago, I mean tech substitution at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the shape of the curve is really similar. From 41% to 2%, in industrial jobs, we've gone from 31% to 7%, and the shape of that curve is going to continue to go down. The way that it goes down matters a lot to particular families' lives, and we should have bigger discussions about what that looks like, but we should start by understanding where we are in history. Transition to the second point. When you talk about protectionism as if it's going to protect those jobs, you don't have any theory to defend your position, and you don't have any history to defend your position. So here's what actually happens when there's more protectionism, and let's talk in a little bit of detail about the current steel tariffs idea. Here's what happens if we put these steel tariffs in place. Consumers lose. Whenever there are more tariffs, which just means tax on consumers, whenever there are more tariffs, consumers on both sides of a border lose, because you're telling voluntary parties who wanted to make something and sell it, and another voluntary party that wanted to make something and buy it, that they can't go through with that transaction. A government is going to stand between you and say, we want less of these transactions, and so we're going to put taxes in here to disincentivize this transaction. Consumers on both sides always lose whenever there's more protection, because there were voluntary choices people wanted to make for higher quality, lower cost goods that they're now prohibited from making because of some policymaker. That's register one of the equation. Register two of the equation is, well, what happens to the protected industry and to other domestic industries that need that industry as an input? Pardon me. I'm going to come back to that in just a second, because the assumption most Americans make is that, well, consumers may lose from protectionism, but producers must win, and so then we net out whether or not this equation is on net good. That's not true, but I'm going to come back to the question about the equation around producers and steel. Then the third register in the equation is retaliatory stuff. So when we decide to put protective tariffs in place, we can be sure, because it's always what has happened, that there will be retaliatory tariffs against the US. As recently as a couple months ago, when we decided to put tariffs in place against washing machines and against solar panels, what did China target? They targeted sorghum, and there are specific farmers in my state who've come into my office and talked to me about what's happened to their marketplace and to the futures markets in their place, in their space. So retaliatory tariffs are inevitable, and that we always lose in that register 3 as well. Now, the only thing that's disputable is what happens in register 2. So let's talk about the steel industry in America. How many steel workers do you think there are? You don't need to shout it out, but sort of take a guess in your head. How many people do you think work in production steel in the United States? 140,000. How many people do you think work in industries that use steel as a primary input for their factory jobs? 5.5 million. The steel tariffs that we're talking about in Washington, D.C. will kill jobs in America in steel. So consumers always lose with protectionism. Retaliated against industries always lose with protectionism, but even the politicians' rhetorical lie that they're going to save steel jobs, it's not true. You're going to cost steel jobs with these tariffs. The only question is how many. There are 2 studies that have been done so far trying to model what happens with these protective tariffs, and they have between 6-to-1 and 13-to-1 job loss. So The Economist had a piece out last week called The President's War with Adam Smith, and their analysis says that it's going to be 13 lost jobs for every job preserved in the steel industry. There's a bigger modeling that's been done that speculates there'll be 33,000 saved steel production jobs and 179,000 lost jobs, so a net loss of 146,000. You look back to the steel tariffs at the end of George Bush 43's first administration. The administration knew by the 11th month that they were losing jobs in the industry they were seeking to protect with their steel tariffs. So second point here is, indisputably, trade is good for America overall, and trade is good for workers, even in the industries we're seeking to protect. That doesn't change the fact that there are bad actors out there. China is doing bad things with a bunch of their oversupply in general in industries and in steel in particular. Here's the good news. When the US uses dispute resolution mechanisms that already exist, we almost always win. When we go to the WTO, we win more than 90% of the time. Steel tariffs against China's bad practices have led to a reduction on the order of 2/3, slightly more than 2/3 probably, over the last 48 months, because we've been targeting certain Chinese bad practices. And it turns out, when we're concerned about other Chinese bad practices, the best way to move forward is with other people who believe in the rule of law and getting them to come together with us through extant organizations to try to defend anti-tariff behavior and attack non-tariff barriers as well. But all of that would assume that we have enough shared literacy to understand what's happening in trade. And here's one of the big problems we have. The term trade deficit sets off bells in people's minds that we're losing in some definable way because someone else is cheating. Sometimes there is cheating, and we should be vigorous and vicious in our response, but we should be public and deliberate. We shouldn't make up a national security clause as a way to try to do something when there's specific bad action by China that we can resolve through mechanisms that already exist in a rule of law order. So here's the problem with trade deficit. We have a picture in our mind of what trade deficit means. And if you go to Mexico and you go into a retail store, it is true that you're not going to find a whole bunch of products made of plastic and steel that have stamped "Made in the USA" on the bottom. When you go into a Walmart 10 miles from here, you're going to find lots of plastic and steel products that have "Made in Mexico" stamped on the bottom of them. So is the US losing? Are we losing as consumers? Are we losing as producers? We have to go one step deeper down the supply chain. And it turns out if you go to the factory in Mexico that's supplying a lot of the plastic and steel stuff that is sold in their retail stores and sold in our Walmarts, the big machines in those factories in Mexico are probably made in the United States. What does that mean? It means that they're loaded up with services surplus. They have US accounting in those machines. They have US engineering in those machines. They have US lawyering in those machines. They have US product design in those machines. They have US finance in those machines. So the export of that machine carried with it a whole bunch of services surplus, and the dollars that we're spending to buy stuff that come off that assembly line in Mexico are reinvested in the US in terms of foreign direct investment that allows us to advance the next generation of those higher end machines. The failure of Washington to have a big discussion with the American people about what is actually happening in the economy has huge negative implications for our economics, for our civil society, and for our national security. Because ultimately, the people need to be told the truth. The people deserve to be told an honest answer about where we are in economic history. The people need not to be lied to saying we're going to make it 1950 again, because it's not true, and it's not going to help the specific workers in the specific disrupted industries, and it sure as heck isn't going to help their kids to be told that the primary problem they face is that they're a victim of other people who are cheating them. That's not true. What's actually needed for the United States and for our workers and for our educational system, which needs to be radically upgraded, is to prepare for the more nimble economy of the future, which is inevitable. I was born in 1972. Average duration at a firm in the 70s was 26 years. Average duration at a firm today is 4 years and change. Where do we talk about this? The number one driver of uninsurance in America, health uninsurance, is job change. The public has no idea. When you survey the American people, why do we have so much, why is uninsurance so much greater in 2010 than in 1990? Because a radical increase in health uninsurance in America. You know what the public thinks? There are two big answers: socioeconomic status and health status. But we don't have more sick people, and we don't have more poor people. So why do we have more uninsured people? Because you tend to be uninsured for 4 to 6 months every time you change jobs. And once you're changing jobs every 4 years, it means you're uninsured 1/8 of the time. That's not a small problem. That's a structural problem that means when you get the breast cancer diagnosis, when you have the car accident, there's a 12% chance that you're going through a period of structural uninsurance that means you're the uninsurable population. You're the people with the pre-existing conditions 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. We should talk honestly about that. The reality is we need to create a mobile economy where we rethink the architecture of industrial era job benefits from the mid-1960s. Because we're not going back to the 1950s and 1960s, no matter how much anybody wanted to. The only thing this city has really gotten done in the last half century in terms of upgrading the social compact and the assumptions we make about where our benefits come from is defined benefit retirement plans. Until 1986, we still had an assumption that everybody would have a defined benefit pension for their whole life from their one firm that was their cradle to grave or their high school retirement or college, high school graduation or college graduation until retirement experience. But that's not what people go through. When I was a college president, we would look at survey data on what do we know about the graduates of that year? What was the current expectation? The average college graduate in 2014, the last year I was a college president, the average graduate of our college could assume that they were going to change not just jobs, but industries 3 times in their first decade post-college. We need to radically rethink what it looks like to be a nimble worker for the 21st century, and that starts by telling the truth about how fast AI and machine learning are going to disrupt this economy. The McKinsey study, I used to work at McKinsey, and at the McKinsey Global Institute, they had a report come out in November of 2017 that I highly recommend to you. They spent about 18 months modeling 46 countries, 91% of global GDP, and 800 job categories. 91% of global GDP. And their prediction, based on their modeling, is that 55% of total economic tasks in the global economy today will be disrupted inside 12 years based on already available AI. This is not 2 chess moves from some new technology that may be created in 2021 and be applied by 2029. This is based on AI that exists today. What share of global economic jobs are disrupted inside the next 12 years? That's not to say, mind you, that 55% of jobs evaporate. This is 55% of tasks, which means when you bundle and unbundle current jobs, they speculate that 60% of today's jobs are more than 30% automatable. That tends to set off bells in people's minds that make the assumption that nobody is going to be able to have any stability in a job. That's not true, but you're probably not going to have any stability in a job if you don't plan to upskill as you go forward in your career. This is what ATMs did that surprised Americans in the 1970s and 80s. Right? My mom, farm kid, coming off the farm, didn't go to college, didn't know anybody who'd really gone to college in her family, and she became a bank teller soon after graduating from high school, and this is in the late 1960s. The ATM is created in 1967 in London and starts coming to the US in 1969-70. The assumption at the time was that ATMs are going to upend all of these teller jobs in America. You know what actually happened over the next 30 years? A pretty significant expansion in the number of tellers in America. Why? Because it turned out tellers did a whole bunch of different things, and most of their time was spent on really, really low-value tasks, like recounting the money in their drawer and trying to match it with their book at the end of the day and counting it over and over and over again. And it turns out machines are much better than this at people. But tellers at that point were almost a 100% female job. Loan officers were almost a 100% male job. You know what happened over the course of the 20 years that the ATM came to the US? the average bank went from needing 21 tellers to needing less than 13. And what that led to was a radical expansion in the number of branches and franchises that banks could afford to open. And what happened was women climbing the career ladder and beginning to take over more and more of the tasks that had been loan officer jobs as they started to sell investment products and sign people up for credit cards and all sorts of different products that seemed to be well beyond the historic role of a teller. It reoriented things in ways that no central planner could have ever predicted, but ultimately in ways that led to the greater service of banks to lots of people across the economy, but also lots more career opportunities for people. I think the McKinsey study suggests that similar things will happen in our time. Lots of jobs that look like they might evaporate might actually climb the ladder of productive value for your neighbor. All of this points us forward, and I'll move toward wrapping up here, points us forward to what are the global security implications of this. We are in a geopolitical competition with primarily China. But what we should recognize is our three, if you think about global security challenges for the US, we tend to bucket them 5 ways. We say Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and have a catch-all category for jihadis. So there's jihadi mess all over the world, but not primarily driven by a particular set of nation-state actors. When you look at the Chinese strategy, the Russian strategy, and the Iranian strategy, ask yourself this question. Do their neighbors like them or not? Why? Why do China's neighbors, Russia's neighbors, and Iran's neighbors not like them? This may seem a little too poetic, it may seem a little too romantic, but because those nations don't believe in souls. We actually believe in universal human dignity. The American idea is premised on a certain set of assumptions about dignity. And so we believe, particularly for the 320 million people that we're all called in this room to serve, but as an anthropological matter, we believe it for 7.5 billion people across the face of the globe. We believe they're created with inherent dignity and that God gives them rights by nature. Government just exists to secure our rights. Government isn't the author or source of our rights. Nobody in Tehran, in Moscow, or Beijing thinks about their economic and military ambitions by talking first about the dignity of their neighbors. They talk about how they can sow chaos among their near neighbors to create a buffer and a barrier against other people getting to them. They think if their near neighbors are weak, they're protected, they're insulated. We believe exactly the opposite. We believe that when our allies are strong, we're strong, and when we're strong, our allies are strong. We don't believe there's a zero-sum game between the US and Canada. We don't believe there's a zero-sum game between the US and Mexico. We actually believe that when Mexico is thriving, there's less chaos on our border. We believe that when Canada is thriving, the global shop floor that is North America means that BMW and Mercedes decide to start manufacturing cars destined for Europe in South Carolina and Alabama. That's pretty extraordinary. If you go to Germany today, the X Series, one of the most common BMWs on the road, the X Series doesn't have any manufacturing in Europe. It's done exclusively in South Carolina. That's amazing. Why does that happen? Because we have a North American global shop floor that produces really high quality, low cost stuff because we don't believe things are a zero-sum game. And so when American public rhetoric starts, when American public rhetoric degrades and declines to the place where someone can say a phrase like, NAFTA's been good for Mexico, and Americans hear in their mind, well, then we must have got taken. We must have negotiated some bad deal, because if NAFTA's been good for Mexico, then we must have lost. That assumes that every deal is a zero-sum game. It's not true of trade. Trade is a win-win. There are deals in the world. If in a real estate deal, if after the deal you find out that your counterparty got a really good deal, then you maybe didn't negotiate that well. Because if that deal went through and your counterparty got a really good deal, you probably left some money on the table. You probably overpaid. But that's not how trade works. And trade is a really good picture of a commerce between peoples who believe in their dignity, who want the best for each other, who want the best for their own consumers and families and producers, and who therefore also end up thinking that military alliances between us are probably good for them and good for us. It's the best bulwark against the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative that you can imagine, But right now, we're doing none of that in this city as we deliberate about what the next century looks like. Thanks for having me. Kim asked me to take one question, and I'm going to defer to someone with, we'll go right here.
Senator, can you provide the sense of where the GOP and the Senate is regarding trade, specifically on NAFTA? You opposed Mr. Lighthizer nomination originally last year, but where are things at this time? Has the conference moved somewhere towards a more free trade position, or it's always been there? And how you think GOP voters will hear this message of tariffs and protectionism going forward?
Yeah, so I'll speak. Kim wanted us to take one question, I think, to keep me on a short leash on time, and you just asked a question that's worthy of about 8 hours of response. So I'll just say very briefly something about the folks that I'm privileged to serve at home, and then I'll make a slightly longer comment about what if the Republican Party knows what it stands for. At the level of getting to represent 1.9 million Nebraskans, we are, I think, the most export-dependent state per capita in the Union. We are the most productive land in human history. There's nobody better at feeding the world than Nebraska farmers and ranchers today. And what we grow, we can't possibly eat it all. So we need export markets to do well what we do great, right? And so ultimately, we want a world where comparative advantage works for us as consumers and families and moms and dads at the store, but as producers who are better than anybody else in the world. In the same way that your household shouldn't spend time doing something that it would cost you a lot more to build than you could buy, no nation should want to be filled with people who spend a whole bunch of time producing something that's far more costly to produce than they could buy abroad, and Nebraskans get that. So where I'm from, quite apart from party, people understand that trade is a really, really big deal. Our politicians, a lot harder to understand what motivates these people. I'm one of, I think, a single-digit number of people in the US Senate who's never been a politician before. Being skeptical of politics is not an argument for a mushy middle. I'm the second or the third most conservative voter in the US Senate by voting record. I think according to the Heritage Scorecard, I'm second. So this is not an argument for mushy middle, but I'm really skeptical of both of these parties standing for very much right now. I think there was some survey data out last fall where when you do forced choice on the American people, are you more Republican or more Democrat? You don't give them the choice to say none of the above. Are you more Republican or more Democrat? About 46% of people, which is the plurality winner, interrupt to say none of the above. So when it's not a choice, they still want to register their disapproval with these parties. I think it's about 29% Dem, about 25% R. If you're in my party, that's pretty scary because the 29% that's Dem are much younger than the 25% that are R when you look toward the future. But when you drill a layer deeper, why are you Republican? Why are you Democrat? About 2/3 of voters respond by telling you how much they hate the other party. So all we're really doing is anti right now. I think it's a fair hypothesis to say America's 10% Democrat, 8% Republican, and 82% toss you all out. And I get that sentiment, right? And so I think that at trade, the public wants a big discussion. That's my belief. When you give them a binary choice, right now, it's a lot easier to scapegoat trade than to talk in any detail about the complexities of what we're going through with automation and disruption in the economy. We need that bigger discussion so we can make rational decisions on policy about trade. Inside my party, inside the 51 Republican senators, I think overwhelmingly, almost everyone is still pro-free trade. Whether or not they have the courage of their convictions to say that in public is much less clear. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, right. Why did you schedule him first?
Good afternoon, and in continuation of this discussion on the North America Free Trade Agreement and its implications, Ambassador Negroponte asked as we were walking up here, why'd you schedule the senator first? This is going to be difficult to be able to top those remarks and the discussion that he engendered, but I think it does better inform it. And I'm going to go out of order in terms of who's sitting up here and start with Ambassador Negroponte by, in the interest of time, obviously everyone up here has had a very distinguished career in government and in service to our nation. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But in introducing Ambassador Negroponte with the first question, I would simply say, as my ambassador in Mexico in the 1989 to 93 period, I can tell you with NAFTA 1.0, in which we served together, he was a 5-time ambassador, Deputy National Security Advisor, Deputy Secretary of State, and the first Director of National Intelligence, where I went and had the privilege of serving with him again as his Chief of Staff in 2005. So a distinguished career. Probably because of that early start on NAFTA, take us back, Ambassador Negroponte, 25-ish years ago, to what led to why we had NAFTA in terms of Mexico's commitment to it, but also the United States and Canada. What was the vision that has served us so well over the last 25 years?
Yeah, thank you, David, and good afternoon, everybody. And David refers to our service together in Mexico. It was an absolute delight to work with you and to work with you in subsequent years as well. And David did have quite a bit to do with the economic issues that we were following at that time, including the two-way negotiations. Well, it's a long story. How do I make it brief? The U.S., I think you have to start with 1985. Mexico decides to join the GATT. Miguel de la Madrid takes the decision that it's time to better integrate the Mexican economy with the rest of the world. And there ensued a period of time where we were holding trade discussions with Mexico on a sector-by-sector basis, automobiles, whatever, appliances, blah, blah. And we got to the administration of Carlos Salinas, and we sort of continued with that approach for a while. But then President Salinas went to Davos in January, I guess it would have been, of 1990. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Eastern European countries had liberated themselves from the Soviet Union. And President Salinas, he saw all these Eastern Europeans lobbying for investments and funds from different private sector investors because they knew going forward they're going to have to depend more on the private sector. And he concluded that Mexico needed to do something more to compete for the world's savings and the world's capital. And he then proposed to President Bush that we consider negotiating in North America a free trade agreement. He expected it to be trilateral. Initially, we preferred to go the bilateral route, frankly, mainly because Mr. Baker had not been enamored of the experience he'd had negotiating the FTA, the bilateral FTA with Canada, not much before then. But once we started down the road of exploring the possibility of a NAFTA, Brian Mulroney beat a hasty path to Kennebunkport, Maine, to ask to join in that negotiation, because I think he was concerned that the U.S., under the other circumstance of us having a bilateral each with Mexico and Canada, would be sort of in this cockpit where we would be just driving everything ourselves. So that brought us to the NAFTA. I really do think it happened because on trade grounds, because I think we realized that the sector-by-sector approach had exhausted its limits. Just how much more can you do that? And you really had to move to the model where you identify the exceptions to your overall free trade policy, rather than going through sector by sector and decide what in the myriad sectors of our respective economies we're going to allow in or out, which could take forever. You could actually still be negotiating a sector by sector trade agreement with Mexico. So that's kind of how it started. The other, I want to introduce the personal and the political notion because I think it was important. The Bush administration was primarily run by Texans. He was a Texan, Jim Baker was a Texan, Robert Mosbacher was a Texan. They understood then, as they understand today, the importance of trade with Mexico. So there was a sort of a political and geographic convergence there that made this possible. And so the rest is history.
And the rest is indeed history, but I think it spoke volumes of the vision that President Salinas de Gortari took on as well, really in challenging his own party at the time in terms of looking at the North and really making that commitment to go into an agreement with the United States.
Except that all of you who know Mexico know that everybody who works on economic policy in Mexico in the last 30, 40 years has got a PhD from MIT or Chicago or Yale or Harvard, you name it, or Princeton.
The best one's from Harvard.
Well, Salinas was Harvard. Pedro Aspe, who was the Treasury Secretary, was MIT, and I think the trade negotiators, quite a few of them were from Chicago. So, and I think that's true to this day. And so they were ahead of their people. And Salinas, by the way, spent a lot of time selling his public on the FTA, these so-called giras presidenciales that he would take one day a week to different states of Mexico. He would meet with ordinary people. I went with him on a couple of them, and he would sit down and painstakingly explain to them why an FTA would be in their interest. And, you know, they were not that easy to convince. There were a lot of people in Mexico who were afraid of a free trade agreement, including practically all the chambers of commerce that you could find in the country.
So let me introduce Ambassador Wayne. Anthony Wayne, long distinguished career as an ambassador as well, with having served in Mexico from 2011 to 2015. He is a career ambassador as of 2010, I believe, in terms of your nomination. Served us well as a nation in Afghanistan and Argentina as ambassador, and just a long and distinguished career. Ambassador Wayne, can you give us a sense of expanding what I think was Senator Sass's fifth point about how NAFTA affected and continues to affect other elements of the relationship with Mexico in particular, but obviously feel free to talk about Canada, well outside the ambit of trade and finance.
Sure. I think the Senate, those were outstanding remarks by the senator. Second, he's exactly right on that point, that when you start trading and investing and working with others, you find other common interests and you develop those. And what we can see over the history of U.S.-Mexico relations is that this developed during the 1990s, the 2000s, the last decade. As you know, there was a large peso crisis in 1995, and then President Clinton made a bold move to support Mexico. That further solidified that cooperation, not just with the trade negotiators, but in that case with the finance people. And right after that, we supported Mexico to join the OECD, for example, the sort of club of largely developed and wealthier economies.
We decided that in the Bush administration.
But it took place in '96, I think, because it takes a while to get in there. And then, still in the early 2000s, we had very good discussions among the financial and trade folk, but it was a little more distant, quite a bit more distant with the foreign ministry. Arturo Sorocan, who's here today, the former ambassador to Mexico, and I have actually talked about this and written a piece about it, how through the 2000s, we gradually expanded our cooperation in foreign policy areas, in other types of international work together. And then sort of a big jump forward was the creation of the Merida Initiative in 2008. And that was under George Bush, the son, and President Calderon. And what that did for the first time is, not that there hadn't been cooperation, but it set up a formal program where we weren't just having law enforcement people work to track down this criminal or that criminal, but we were actually working together to improve institutions and processes, with the Mexicans very much in the lead, but with us providing technical expertise and funding certain kind of equipment and training that went forward. And that, over the years since 2008, has just gone forward and gradually expanded into different areas. It took, when President Calderon left and President Peña Nieto came in, there was a number of months where the new administration was saying, what are we doing with the United States? Are we sure we want to do this? And eventually they said, yes, we do want to keep doing this, because they saw it was a great mutual value. And what's happened under this program is people have also got to know each other. They've built confidence with each other. So now we have very intense dialogues and practical relationships across the border in dealing with migrants coming forward, in dealing with drug gangs, trying to counter drug gangs and drug trafficking. It still has a ways to go in reaching the ultimate ends. It's quite clear if you look at the facts. But just the number of issues that we work on, and this continued in the foreign policy area, let me say also, in international organizations, in helping Central America and looking at the Caribbean, in a whole host of areas that we would not thought of cooperating about when I first came across Mexico in the 70s and 80s, early in my career. So it really has transformed the way Mexicans and Americans have looked at each other. And that's one of the things, very honestly, that I'm most worried about right now in this situation. And you can see it in the polling results. The polls taken by Pew and others in Mexico show that from a 66 favorable view of the United States, it's dropped down to a 30-some favorable view of the United States in Mexico. And when I talk to colleagues and friends, they say, you know, our sons and daughters who grew up in the post-NAFTA era, who looked at the United States as a close partner, a place to learn, a place to grow, sometimes to live, but often just to go study and come back to Mexico, are now taking another look at the United States through these lenses. And that, I think, is the really dangerous potential in this current situation. We don't want to go back to that period of time where Ambassador Negroponte started off, where we were characterized as distant neighbors.
No, very well said, and I can't emphasize enough the current Peña Nieto administration's support on issues such as Venezuela and the crisis that we're facing there as being part of the partnership that reflects. So it's not just the border issues, it's not just the immigration issues, it's not just the transnational crime organizational cooperation in terms of countering that. Juan Zarate, a chairman of and co-founder of the Financial Integrity Network, former colleague of mine at the White House, Deputy National Security Advisor for counterterrorism. Juan, I put in the category of being a national treasure when it comes to really the design in the previous decade of the illicit finance identification as an instrument of national power. And so, Juan, turning to you with the question of NAFTA in the context of international finance and a platform in which NAFTA has been a very useful means to an end of identifying in a transparent kind of way the issues related to illicit finance and challenges that, by Mexico's own admission, they face and that we cooperate on in our current relationship with Mexico. Talk to us a bit about that from your perch where you are today and your observations of it.
Well, thank you, David. First of all, thank you for those really kind words coming from you. It's the highest honor. Thank you for the invitation and to Heritage for having me. I'm happy to carry the bags of these gentlemen who've had distinguished careers, so I'm just happy to be up here. But David, your question is a really important one because if you take the sort of the lens back, both historically and systemically, I think NAFTA is part of a broader story of the deepening of the relationships between the U.S. and Mexico in a way that has drawn our systems much more closely together. And I think, to Tony's point, my experience in the White House, especially during the Merida Initiative period, was one in which we had built upon what were very strong relationships, sector by sector, institution by institution, military, law enforcement, intel, and the financial services sector. And what you saw at in that period was both a deepening of the relationships and a sense of the strategic in some very important ways. And I think there's two things that haven't been mentioned that are worth talking about, and then touch on your question. First was the notion that the U.S. and Mexico were part of a broader global environment in which we had a stake not only in each other's success, but in what was happening around us and with us. And so part of the success of the Merida Initiative was the U.S. and Mexico looking outward toward Central America, toward Latin America, even beginning to talk about the challenge from China in a very interesting way. And I think that began to sort of reshape a bit of the conception of what NAFTA meant in terms of that relationship. Secondly, it was, again, NAFTA that drove this, but in recent years, a deepening of the sense of the systemic links between the U.S. and Mexico. The natural links of commerce and trade and communities, border communities, et cetera, are well known to us, but those between the financial community, those between the infrastructure sector, the transport sector, right, the whole controversy around trucking, et cetera. But the very notion that we were part of systemic links that were critical and important to not only economic growth and security, but also national security. And in that then was a recognition that between, in particular, the U.S. Treasury and Hacienda, the Mexican Treasury Department, that there was a shared interest in the both security and integrity of the financial system, where we faced challenges from drug money laundering, faced challenges from organized crime groups, MS-13 now much in the news, the ability of actors to move money easily globally to evade sanctions, all the things that the U.S. cared fundamentally about from a financial integrity perspective was now a part of the dialogue with Mexico. Now that has not been without challenge, of course. We've all seen and been a part of these discussions on the de-risking of banks and the challenge there, where U.S. institutions, U.S. Treasury, U.S. authorities have demanded much more of Mexican institutions, along with others globally. But the reality has been that that has forged a much deeper conversation around the systemic links between the U.S. and Mexico and what the shared values, standards, practices are, to the extent that it's actually forced and created some incredibly important innovations. The U.S. and Mexico have had a strategic dialogue, bilateral dialogue, where the banking regulators, for example, have cooperated more closely than most other regulators between neighbors, often worried about the same banks or institutions together. You've had financial intelligence units working very closely together. You've had vetted units and law enforcement working closely together on networks of concern. We've just seen recent indictments out of San Diego tied to U.S.-Mexico related links and criminality where U.S. and Mexican authorities have worked very closely together. You've even had the discussion of how to deal with special interest aliens from a counterterrorism perspective and how that works. So in all of its forms, the U.S.-Mexico relationship has been largely around these systemic links and ties and how the U.S. and Mexico, through their authorities, and frankly, even their private sector, can work more closely together to strengthen their systems and to strengthen the ability to deal with financial integrity in a fundamental way. And maybe just a final point, David, if you'll allow me. You know, this is really important as we think about the geopolitical aspects of the challenge from China, but also the future of regional economies. Because I think the reality is that we are like it or not, systemically tied to Mexico, whether it's in the financial sector, whether it's in the infrastructure sector, whether it's because of community ties. My father comes from Guadalajara, so I'm part Mexican, part Cuban, full Californian, full American. But the reality is, systemically, the ties are going to grow even more closely. And when you listen to Secretary Nielsen from the Department of Homeland Security, she's talking rightfully about the security of systems and the cascading threats and resilience that we have to be worried about. And we have to begin to think about Mexico as a key systemic partner, as well as a key element of that resilience when we think about things like supply chain security, when we think about cybersecurity, when we think about transport security. All of that is critical to our own security. And that often is an unstated strategic dimension of the relationship that goes above and beyond, catching one particular criminal or worrying about one particular money laundering case. So, David, I gave you a little bit of breathing room there.
Thank you. My apologies. I have Eric Farnsworth to my left. He has had a distinguished career of really focusing on the Western Hemisphere, State Department, and the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and with the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, as well as Senior Advisor to the White House and Special Envoy to the Americas. Eric, as you look at, perhaps as some have termed it, the necessity to reopen NAFTA, what would be some of the objectives and goals 25 years later as to what we should be looking at by way of outcomes?
Well, thanks, David. And as much as I admire you, I actually was hoping you wouldn't come back. Then I could answer any question that I wanted to, I think. But indeed, I will try to deal with that question, and I'm glad that you're still with us, indeed. Let me also add to all of my colleagues my thanks to Heritage for the invitation. And it's not just, I think, the two ambassadors who are national treasures. It's all four of the others who I share the panel with. Sesame Street, which some of you may recall from your respective youth, used to have a song that was, one of these things is not like the others. And you had to choose which one was not like the others. And so clearly that's me on this panel. But nonetheless, I'm delighted to be with all of you to have this opportunity. The second thing I would say before I try to answer David's very important question is that Senator Sass, I completely agree with what's already been said, gave a terrific presentation in defense of trade. But one of the things that particularly stuck in my mind is the fact that he's a Midwesterner, and so am I. And so for those of you who are looking at your NCAA brackets, as many of you probably are, one bit of advice: don't ever, ever, ever overlook the Mid-American Conference. I had Buffalo. So it's something that for next year, remember the MAC. Indeed, it is a conference to be reckoned with. Nonetheless, David, a very important question. You know, NAFTA was a creature of a previous time. It was almost 25 years ago. The world has changed. Think about it in the context of everything. We heard from Senator Sass about technology and the changes there. Many of the things that we take as routine today, phones and email and social media and just everything that we do in our daily lives, didn't even exist back then. But think about it in terms of the automobile you were driving in 1994 and compare it to the automobile you're driving today, or should I say the automobile that drives itself today. This is technological change that is rapid. It was completely unimaginable to those who negotiated, with all apologies to those who negotiated, but you can't predict the future. NAFTA, however, as a document of the early 90s, didn't capture these changes. It couldn't have. That was impossible. So, David, when you say, what should we be looking to do? We should be looking to update and upgrade the arrangement and include whole categories of beneficial economic exchange that simply didn't exist before. And we should also be including categories of economic exchange that did exist, but weren't included in the original agreement for political reasons, specifically energy. Now, energy was not included in the original NAFTA because it was too politically sensitive in Mexico. It was reserved to the Constitution. It was something that simply was not timely to talk about. Now it is. Mexico's gone through a reform program. Energy dynamics globally have shifted fundamentally. The United States is now exporting energy as opposed to being energy dependent on other countries. This is a shift in the global economy. We should be bringing energy into a new NAFTA. And why would we want to do that? For one of the reasons that has been alluded to by the previous panelists, let me focus on it. The idea of locking in behavior. In other words, trying to determine what is permissible in terms of North American economic exchange and what falls outside of that, so that when there are reforms that are made and brought into NAFTA, it makes it politically much less likely, if indeed not impossible, to backtrack on those reforms. And that's critical. And that's not just an academic exercise. I think it was Ambassador Wayne who referenced the peso crisis in 1995. The peso crisis would not have come out the same way had NAFTA not existed back then. And the reason why is because we had seen that movie before in the 1980s, when Mexico went through a similar peso crisis, and it took them, what, 8 years, 9 years to get back to global capital markets? After NAFTA, after the next peso crisis in 1995, it took them 9 months. And why was that? Because NAFTA required certain behavior that Mexico had to take to keep its market open, to keep its borders open, to keep its trade open with the United States, and to keep it as an economy, to require certain behaviors of the political class that they could not take, that they might have wanted to take, and that they indeed did take later on. Now, all of us, beforehand, in the previous crisis, now all of us have elections. Canada, certainly, the United States, Mexico, and elections have consequences. Mexico faces an election in July. We don't know how that's going to turn out. But what we do know is that if countries have come to a conclusion that it's in their best interest to lock in certain patterns of behavior for the long term, that's then going to bind the leaders of those respective countries to take certain steps. And so that's very much one of the things we should be looking at in the negotiations as we're talking about that. So for example, does it make sense to put in place sunset clauses that would require a whole new negotiation every 5 years? Well, probably not. Not in that context, nor in the context of certainty and credibility for not just investors, but for the entire people of North America who are trying to plan a future together and trying to figure out what that future looks like. And so the second point I would say along those lines is credibility. Look, NAFTA was negotiated by a Republican president. It was passed under a Democratic president. It was passed on a bipartisan basis, on a bicameral basis. That's about as solid as you can get in the context of the United States supporting and underwriting anything. If now the United States is able to unilaterally say, well, we were just joking, who is then going to come forward in any context to say to the United States, yeah, sure, we're going to take your word? And so that whole basis of trust that the three previous panelists have been talking about, it's not to say it's going to evaporate because countries have their own interests, but it will be more challenging, in my view, to be able to come to the same place strategically to say, this is what the United States is going to do, and you can count on us. Right? And so that's something I think we have to be very, very careful about. And then the final thing I would suggest is looking at where the negotiations could come out. China has already been referenced. I think it was by Juan, if I'm not wrong. And that's absolutely right. China existed in 1994, but certainly not in the same way that it exists now in the global economy. And if the United States is looking forward in terms of the ability to compete globally with China, but also with other countries, whether it's on technology, whether it's on whatever it is, you can't do that as an isolated economy. You have to do it with your neighbors in terms of the supply chains that have developed, in terms of the U.S. content that is now in all of the Mexican and Canadian production, 25% from Canada, 40% from the United States. The equivalent U.S. content in Chinese production is 4%, 10 times higher with Mexico than with China. So, if we're looking at partners to try to be able to build our own economic capacity, forget about the strategic for a minute. If it's simply economic, the way to do that is to get closer together with our partners, develop those supply chains in an even deeper way, include more categories than previously existed in the agreement and bind that in for the longer term. And then we've got the basis of a strategy that Senator Sass was talking about in terms of us needing to have something that we can rely on going forward as we increasingly seek to compete effectively with China. So I think there are a number of big issues here, hopefully, that we're keeping in mind as we're negotiating the agreement.
Thank you, Eric. Let's continue to pull the camera back and open the aperture to the implications of a withdrawal from NAFTA. Tony, talk to us a little bit more in terms of the credibility, not only of the United States, were that to happen, in terms of other objectives in the Western Hemisphere and beyond, but how does China, how does Russia, how do other countries respond and react to what they would view potentially as real opportunities to come into that particular space as well?
Well, there are a couple of different angles to this. One certainly is the Chinese angle, and as we know very well, they have already greatly expanded their trade and economic interaction with the rest of Latin America. And others would certainly see a sign that the United States is pulling out of NAFTA as a sign that they better develop relations with other countries. Now, very happily, there's a more positive model that took place with the TPP 11, the other members of the TPP, who many, including me, were worried that they would not be able to continue their negotiation and that China would thus have a lot of space. But Japan really started to show and demonstrate leadership working with Australia and brought the other 11 together, and they just signed in Chile this new agreement, which is the most up-to-date agreement, free trade agreement in the world, and for the first time has an integrated internet-related chapter. And it really is a rules-based agreement that binds everybody, including the least developed countries like Vietnam that are in there, and it sets good standards for them. And a lot of those, of course, are standards the United States argued for and helped get in there before it left. But at a minimum, it's these countries saying, we don't want to be left out there by ourselves, and we can do it working with others. You can have a multilateral rules-based agreement that works and that's beneficial. But the Chinese, as the senator said, as others have said, they have a long-term vision, and they're going to work at that, and they're good at having a long-term vision and working at it. They make mistakes along the way sometimes, as their post-1949 history has shown, some big mistakes. But right now, they seem to be on an economic roll. And as the senator also said, it's not at all clear that we have a strategic plan and vision to take on that competition that's out there. But it's not just about competing with China. This is a global economy where things are going to be changing very rapidly. Most observers agree the rapidity of that change is going to keep going, and it's going to mean that all competitors just have to be smarter and better if they want to keep raising the standard of living effectively of their countries and in their economies. And we need to do that, and trade is a vital part of that, and especially trade in our own hemisphere. I mean, already if you happen to have looked at one of these maps that shows who was the #1 trading partner of countries in the world 10 years ago and who's the #1 partner today, there's a big jump in China and a big reduction in where the U.S. was #1. That's a clarion call to action for us that we should be thinking with that bigger vision and working out from a basis, which should be our production basis is North America. We could make this the North American century if we do it right, or we can let it be somebody else's century if we fall back.
John, Senator Sass spoke of technology being the big disruptor as opposed to trade. How do you respond to those who would suggest that NAFTA is a big employment dislocator. It's an employment loser for sectors of the economy in trying to sell the changes that a NAFTA would project in terms of where we are as an economy, building off of what Tony, Eric, and Juan have already said.
First, let me just say, I agree with others who thought that the senator's remarks were terrific. I really enjoyed them a great deal. And also, you asked me a question about history before. There's one part I forgot to mention, which was actually a key piece of our ability to move from the sector-based to a broader-based trade negotiations, and that was that Mexico resolved its debt issue. The Brady bonds and all of that stuff. Angel Gurria, who was their negotiator, and Nick Brady was involved, and Citibank, I think it was Bill Rhodes, who was leading the consortium, and that was a kind of a bellwether event. And then someone mentioned the peso crisis. Somebody who works on the issue of Greece told me, you know, if only the EU had responded as rapidly to Greece's problems. I mean, Bill Clinton extended whatever that was called, some kind of a bridge loan of $50 billion to Mexico within weeks of when this crisis erupted and saved the situation. If somebody had done that for Greece at the beginning, they might have been able to spare their entire crisis. The question of job loss and technology and so forth, I think you can, I mean, I haven't gone and done this lately, but you can probably demonstrate where NAFTA has saved jobs in the United States by going to the point about 4% versus 40% or whatever. And you can even find examples of companies that had relocated to China and now are starting to come back to North America because competitive conditions here have improved. So I think the answer is, we're not losing jobs because of manufacturing jobs. And there were some instances where I remember explicitly companies telling me, by putting a plant in Mexico, we're saving a number of very high-quality jobs in the United States. And I wouldn't be surprised if that argument still prevails. But I think even the broader argument is the one Tony's making, which is this North American platform. One other point, an area that I'd be very afraid of if we were not to renew or if we were to abandon the NAFTA, which I personally don't believe we will, but if we were to do that, is in the energy sector. Because here we are, they've got energy reform. We're just becoming this major energy producer. And I understand now this, in the last round, they agreed to have an energy chapter in the NAFTA. And, why create an opportunity for China and Russia to penetrate the Mexican energy market, which is if you just look, you want to see the copybook, just look at what's happening in Venezuela. If you want to know what's going to happen in Mexico long-term if we drop the NAFTA and don't have good provisions on energy in this revised agreement.
Juan, you look like...
Yeah, I know. I want to say amen to what Pastor Negroponte has just said, because I think, I'm not an economist, so I can't, speak to data. And obviously there's issues of worker retraining and other things to deal with the technological changes. But I think the reality here is if we absence ourselves from NAFTA or a trade deal that binds the U.S. and Mexico and the North American corridors Tony was talking about, we shrink the imagination and we shrink opportunity, right? And the last example that Ambassador Negroponte gave is the best, right? Because we are now at a point of being not only an energy exporter, but an energy giant in a way that has strategic impact that we haven't even fully conceived yet. And so if we shut off the aperture of the opportunity because of not only not having NAFTA in place, but creating anti-American antibodies in the system, which needs to be recognized. And I think Senator Sass alluded to this. There's a human dimension to this, and Tony, you did as well. if we pull back, there's going to be a sense of resentment and a sense of retreat in a way that does not only hurt the United States in terms of what's in the realm of the possible, but also then from the Mexican side, what they're willing to do, what they're willing to sacrifice, where they're willing to see mutual benefit or interest or even cost, right? And so that's exactly where the Chinese and other actors are very willing to play, especially when they're perhaps playing by different rules, willing to play by different economic margins, right? All the things that we've seen China do in other environments. And so I worry about the ripple effect of the of both the psychological and the element of economic imagination that's lost if we retreat, because then we're left with picking up the pieces as opposed to thinking forward in as aggressive a way as possible. That then also has regional impact. And David, you and Tony were talking about this a bit. I do wonder what this does for a broader U.S. LATAM policy and how other partners around the world and in particular in the region view U.S. staying power, view the attractiveness of U.S. capital and investment. They're still going to be interested in it, of course, but it's going to have a different tinge to it. And I worry about the psychological, political, and economic impact of that, which I don't think anyone can project yet, and there are probably no numbers for it. But at the end of the day, that's harmful to the U.S. overall, not helpful.
Could I just add one factoid that I think it's really useful to remember, especially because the first number came out of a heritage study in 1993, I think it was. The estimate was 700,000 U.S. jobs tied to trade with Mexico. So the estimate, looking at 2015 numbers, was 4.9 million. So it's hard, for me, it makes it very hard to argue there's been a net loss of jobs. There is a loss of jobs, and it's not the same people that got new jobs. And that's the problem. That's what the senator was talking about, and that's what we all need to talk about. But there's no question that we have created new jobs in all three countries, but for this debate, importantly in the United States, out of our growing trade with Mexico. And there's a study that was just done down in Texas, just looking at the border states. And it argues that if we take the next step forward in border integration, we will create 900,000 to 1 million new jobs just in the border states of the United States, not counting the Mexico side. So there's no question that a new modern NAFTA with more efficiency at the border, with more connectivity, can create a lot more jobs and can make us more productive compared to others in the world.
Eric, in the little bit of time that we have left, can you talk a little bit about what Canada's demands are and where might it come off the rails from the Canadian standpoint in terms of dispute resolution, dairy? I think those are the couple of the areas where there's been some real conflict, but there may be other areas in terms of Canada in this.
Well, those definitely are two of the most important areas. I would also add cultural reservations. The interesting thing about this is that these aren't new issues. These are actually issues we had to deal with the first time. And this gives our negotiating partners another bite at this apple and to have actually expanded in some cases the demands. And so, but they are real. And it's interesting in Washington, oftentimes we think that we're the only ones, we in the United States are the only ones with interests or demands. And we have to remember that our negotiation partners have theirs as well. And they're equally politically sensitive in those economies. And they are equally tied to elections and democracy and results along those lines as well. And the interesting thing about Canada, of course, is it does not have the same electoral calendar as we do, parliamentary system, et cetera. They're not on the Mexican calendar. They don't have elections coming up in July. They don't have U.S. midterms, et cetera. So they have the ability to wait this one out a little bit longer. No, and they're playing that. And Prime Minister Trudeau, when he was in Chicago just recently, said as much. He said, look, you know, we want a NAFTA, but we want a good NAFTA, and that's what we're going to hold out for. And in the Canadian context, that's in some ways arguing for some of the same things that were so controversial in the past and had to be part of the final negotiation. In fact, according to some histories, the last thing to be resolved in the original NAFTA had nothing to do with Mexico. It was actually Chapter 19, and it was demand of Canada. And it was Jim Baker who ultimately had to make the call and say, yeah, for NAFTA, we're going to do this. But Canada was willing to say, we're not going to do it, based on Chapter 19, of course, is dispute resolution. And so that's something that remains a very important part of the dialogue today. So in some cases, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, right? So it's one of these things. But the final thing I would say, I know time is short, but there was a letter that was just released yesterday, actually, by 10 former commanders of the United States Northern Command, which is, of course, Canada and Mexico, as well as CONUS, Continental United States, and former commanders of the Southern Command, and talked specifically about those issues, the issues of NAFTA from an economic perspective, sure, but more importantly from the broader strategic perspective. And if you haven't seen that, I would call that to your attention. It is really an important statement, and I think it encaptures in a very short space some of these issues that I think really call to attention the fact that NAFTA is an economic agreement, yes, but more importantly, it's a strategic agreement. And on that basis, I would say that the United States really needs to keep pushing forward and see if we can't come to some sort of closure on that basis.
Okay, Juan, rapid round with the four of you. 2 months from now, where will we be on NAFTA?
I'm an optimist, but I have to be honest. I'm not quite sure. I have to think the emphasis on national economic security that's now in the national security strategy for the first time in a very heavy way. The heavy focus on China as a competitor and even a challenger in the economic space. The need for the U.S. not to upset too many apple carts with too many allies, and I think we've seen this in the tariff debate, I think lends, at least in my sense, lends itself to suggesting we are going to see positive progress and not a ditching of NAFTA. I don't know if we get a deal before the relative elections, but I'm more optimistic than not, given both the dynamics internally, but more importantly, the external dynamics, which I think are going to be more and more important. And in that regard, watch the Iran deal, because the question about what happens to the Iran deal impacts how the Europeans view the United States and whether or not the U.S. is viewed as simply a bull in the China shop, destroying every agreement possible, or whether or not the president can demonstrate he can capture a win with key allies in Canada and Mexico.
I agree with Juan that it's very important to look at the broader geostrategic playing board, and that will impact this negotiation where we are. I think we'll be one of two places. We're either going to make good progress, and so we'll take a pause as the elections take place on the basis of that good progress, and maybe have technical work go ahead and then look forward to re-engaging. Or NAFTA will be dragging on in this uncertain state until the Mexican elections and the new president comes in, and we have to take it up either very, very late this year or early next year. I hope it's the former. I hope Juan's optimism is correct. And I think that would be much better for all three countries and the United States. But I'm not yet sure which of those two it's going to be.
I think it'll go through. Whether it happens now or later, I don't know, but it's in the mutual interest of all three countries. And I think we have enough interests, affected interests in this country who have spoken up so that it must have registered in the White House. In fact, I'm sure it has. And the other thing is, in addition to watching whatever happens to the Iran deal, I would watch what we do with China. And if we take some tough measures against China, that might actually relieve some of the pressure on NAFTA, to take tough action on NAFTA.
I obviously have no crystal ball either, although one positive signal I would note is that in the recent 232 steel tariffs, Canada and Mexico were both exempted, at least temporarily. So that's probably a good sign. And I'm also optimistic in the sense that I think people do recognize the importance of NAFTA and are going to continue to work forward to try to bring this to a conclusion. Whether that will be done in the next 2 months, I can't say. The final thing I would say, however, is that generally to this point, and for obvious reasons, this has been a conversation among the 3 executive branches, but it is apparent that the U.S. Congress and Senate are both becoming increasingly active on this as well, and are making very clear to the White House, at least, in what provisions they would accept. Don't forget, once this thing is negotiated, it has to be brought back to the U.S. Congress. And if it can't pass the Congress, it really doesn't matter at some level what's been negotiated. This is something that has to be brought into account. From a positive perspective, my sense is that Congress is increasingly part of this conversation, which it should be, it needs to be. And I think that will continue to push forward to a positive conclusion.
And I would add that to the Congress, a number of governors that are
Absolutely.
most deeply affected as well have now joined the conversation. My call is NAFTA will continue strategic pause probably in the next 2 months, and we will be looking at it toward the end of the calendar year / 2019 in terms of closure. Anyway, thank you, panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you, Heritage, for hosting us, and go free trade. Thank you.